She was Henry VIII's daughter-in-law and Anne Boleyn's cousin. But what do we know about the life of Mary Howard, Duchess of Richmond and Somerset, who was married to the king's illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy as a teenager, and how and why did her father-in-law treat her so badly after Anne and Fitzroy's deaths? Before we start, please remember to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on to keep up to date with my uploads, and also to hype the video, which is a fairly new feature on YouTube that I keep meaning to ask people to use to help to promote my content, but I keep forgetting. Anyways, I'd be very grateful if you would consider doing that. Lady Mary Howard was born in around 1519. The daughter of Thomas Howard, then the Earl of Surrey, but later the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, and his wife Elizabeth Stafford. This made her the first cousin of Queen Anne Boleyn and Queen Catherine Howard on her father's side, and ultimately the first cousin once removed of the future Elizabeth I. We know little about her childhood, but she lived at Tendrig, Hunsdon and Kennel in Norfolk and had at least 4 siblings, including brother Henry, who was known as the Earl of Surrey. Her parents' marriage was a disaster, not least because the Duke kept an in-house mistress called Elizabeth Holland, and the couple formally separated in the 1530s, with the Duchess of Norfolk alleging serious abuse from her husband, which he denied. As a member of the powerful Howard clan, Mary was a serious catch on the marriage market, and there were early plans to marry her off to Lord Bulbeck, son and heir of the Earl of Oxford. The trajectory of her life would take a very different turn, however, thanks to the activities of her cousin Anne, which meant these plans for a union with Bulbeck were dropped in 1529. By that year, Anne Boleyn was the acknowledged mistress of Henry VIII, with plans of becoming his second wife. She was the most powerful woman at court, having eclipsed Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in his affections, and her family were on the rise with her. Now Henry and Catherine had only one surviving child, Princess Mary, but the king also had an illegitimate son called Henry Fitzroy, born in 1519 to the monarch's ex-mistress Bessie Blount, and created Duke of Richmond and Somerset in 1525. I'll leave my videos on the life of Fitzroy and his mother linked below for you. As the king's only boy and a possible heir to the throne in lieu of a legitimate son, as well as a double duke, Fitzroy was going to need a suitably grand marriage, and Lady Mary represented just that. Her father would always maintain that the king instigated the match. That's what he told the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis at least, but her mother, the Duchess, said that it was Anne Boleyn's idea. Now, why would Anne want her cousin to marry her stepson? Well, one theory is that with no son of her own, she didn't want Richmond marrying a European princess and creating an alliance which would enable him to make a play for the throne at some point. Having him safely married into her own family would hopefully neutralise that threat, though I would say it also meant that her family had a backup option if Anne's relationship with the king failed, as they could now hope to position Mary Howard as a possible queen consort to Henry Fitzroy. The engagement was finalised in 1531, but as the youngest age for a consummated marriage for a girl was 12 at this time and 14 for a boy, it would be 1533 before Fitzroy was old enough to be properly wed. In the meantime, Mary's position at court was secured through her participation in some very high-profile events. On the 1st of September 1532, Anne Boleyn was created the Marchioness of Pembroke in her own right, and at the ceremony in Windsor Castle, her cousin Mary carried her train and handed the coronet to King Henry to place on his mistress's head. The following April, with Anne pregnant with the future Queen Elizabeth and finally married to Henry, the new queen attended Mass on Easter Saturday. We have an account of the event from Eustace Chapuis, who wrote to Charles V of Spain on the 15th of April that, "On Saturday, Easter Eve, Dame Anne went to Mass in royal state, loaded with jewels, clothed in a robe of cloth of gold frieze. The daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, who is affianced to the Duke of Richmond, carried her train." After Princess Elizabeth was born on the 7th of September, the girl, who was already her first cousin once removed and soon to be her sister-in-law, carried the chrism at the infant's baptism a few days later. The Duke of Richmond had now turned 14, and it was time to make the marriage official. Chapuis wrote on the 3rd of September that the Duke of Richmond is also returning from France to marry the daughter of Norfolk, and return he did. A dispensation had been issued from Rome to allow for the fact that he and Mary were related within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity, and on the 26th of November 1533 at Hampton Court Palace, the two were wed properly. Interestingly, the Duke of Norfolk did not have to pay the huge dowry that would normally have been required to secure such a match for his daughter. Further evidence perhaps that his niece Anne Boleyn was working for the union behind the scenes in order to get the king to forego this. Richmond's biographer, Beverly A. Murphy, her book is one of the secondary sources I used for this video and is linked below, notes that the couple probably barely knew each other, given that Mary had been at court while Richmond had been in France, and that the marriage seemed to be a fairly quiet affair, barely remarked upon by Eustace Chapuis, who simply told his boss, Charles V, that there is no other news except that the Duke of Richmond is to be married tomorrow to the Duke of Norfolk's daughter, and then said no more about it. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, saw it as no more than a throwaway line of gossip too, telling Archdeacon Hawkins on the 20th of December that the Duke of Richmond has married Lady Mary, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, but again offering no further detail. The pair were not allowed to live together immediately, presumably so that they could be a little more mature before they became parents, and after the wedding, Mary went back to her job in Queen Anne's court. As it turned out, they would never cohabit, and the marriage was never consummated. As a result, there is very little to say about it, though it was at some point during it, maybe in 1535 or 1536, that Mary was drawn by the famous court artist Hans Holbein the Younger, giving us our only glimpse of her. The drawing was abandoned at an early stage, and no portrait was ever created from it that we are aware of, perhaps because of the upheavals which occurred in Mary's life in 1536, which severely diminished her position at court. First of all, Queen Anne fell from grace, accused of treason, adultery, and even incest with her brother George. Both Boleyns were executed in May 1536, along with several other men accused alongside them. Anne's execution was to be the last public appearance of the Duke of Richmond too. Weeks later, on the 23rd of July, another blow fell on Mary when her husband died, seemingly of consumption. His remains were given to her father for burial and quietly interred in Thetford Priory in a funeral attended by Mary. 3 years later, with the abbeys being dissolved, the Duke of Norfolk had the body moved to the Church of St. Michael the Archangel in Framlingham, where it still lies today. The 17-year-old Dowager Duchess of Richmond and Somerset had now lost her strongest connections to the royal family. Her husband and cousin Anne were dead, and the 2-year-old Princess Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title. Despite the fact that she had likely barely known Fitzroy, Mary went into official mourning for him, as was expected of her, and returned to her father's house at Kennel in Norfolk, now long since destroyed. That November, the Duke of Norfolk told Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's senior minister, that it is not possible for a young woman to handle herself more discreetly than she hath done since her husband's death. She inherited a few items from Fitzroy, silver spoons, other plate and jewels, and some horses and their accoutrements. What she really needed, though, was her jointure, that is, the share of a husband's estate which was to be held by his widow to support her, either for life or until her remarriage. On this issue, though, Henry VIII proved to be very difficult. The king almost immediately questioned the validity of a marriage which had not been consummated, for if his son wasn't really married to Mary Howard, then her jointure of £1,000 per year did not have to be provided. He referred the matter to his lawyers, who promptly stalled. A year later, there was still no sign of the money, despite the Duke of Norfolk's letters pleading his daughter's case. It is at this point that we start to get a sense of Mary's personality. Rather than sit meekly back and wait for her father to get her jointure, she was pushing hard to make this happen. A little naively, for someone who'd recently seen 2 of her cousins executed on trumped-up charges, She couldn't believe how poorly the king was treating her, telling her father in December 1537 that, "I am sure he, the king, would never suffer the justice of his laws to be denied to me, the unworthy, desolate widow of his late son, that never yet was denied to the poorest gentlewoman in this realm." Try telling that to Anne Boleyn. Almost concurrently, on the 2nd of January 1538, she wrote to Thomas Cromwell herself, expressing doubts that her father was working hard enough for her, and asking to come to London to see the king in person. The letter is one of just a handful of her correspondence to have survived, and it says, "In mine humble manner I commend me to your good lordship, and where it hath pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy my late lord and husband 1 year and a half past, to my most sorrow and discomfort, and my lord my father, under whose tuition I am, hath many times promised me to be a suitor to the king's majesty for obtaining of my dower," which is another word for jointure, "whereof as yet there hath no good effect come to me, nor, I fear me, by his means of long time shall not. Most humbly and heartily I beseech your good lordship to help me, a desolate widow, that by your good means I may obtain my right, and to be a suitor to his highness for me for the same. Of truth, about a fortnight past, I wrote a letter to my lord my father, beseeching him to give me license to come up to sue his majesty for mine own cause, whereunto he made me so short an answer that I am more than half in despair to obtain by his suit. Alas, good my lord, you that do many deeds, help me, the poorest widow of the realm." Mary showing a serious lack of awareness there about what it was like to be a genuinely poor widow, "and deliver mine humble supplication, which you shall receive with this to his highness. And if it may stand with his highness's pleasure to remit my said cause to the judges and his learned council, I am in no doubt they will inform his majesty that my right is perfect good. There is but one thing, as my council say unto me, that doth delay, nor can my matter, which is that I cannot have out the writs, wherein by your good mediation I trust his highness will not deny me, which never unto this time was denied to lady or gentlewoman in this realm. Finally, my good lord, most humbly I beseech you to be my good lord concerning the premises, and I shall daily pray to Almighty God for your long prosperity." Her father was obviously exasperated with her efforts, thus the short answer she'd received from him when she pressed him to pursue her dowry, and he would later write to the king that, "My lord, in all my life I never communed with her in any serious cause until now, and would not have thought she had been such as I find her, which I think is but too wise for a woman." Clearly, Mary was a force to be reckoned with. Beverly A. Murphy has compared her intelligence and forcefulness to that of her cousin Anne Boleyn, and I can see why. Still, I think we should spare a thought for her father. Would you want to annoy Henry VIII by demanding a huge sum of money for your daughter when he just had your niece and nephew executed? Norfolk was probably wiser than Mary in this instance when it came to not poking the bear too hard. Nevertheless, the consensus was that Mary was actually correct in her assertion of her rights, and even Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, agreed, for when asked for Cromwell for his opinion on the case, he responded that, "I assure your lordship that without further convocation of doctors, I am fully persuaded that such marriages as be in lawful age, contracted per verba de presenti, are matrimony before God, and the same cause is, as I remember, plainly opined and declared in the King's Grace's book of his own cause of matrimony." The Church and the law were in lockstep here. Mary was the Dowager Duchess of Richmond and Somerset, and she was entitled to her jointure. Still, though, it was not forthcoming. Mary's attempts to get her money are not the only instance in which we can see her intelligence. She was also a patron of literature, though somewhat ironically she had pretty awful handwriting. Nevertheless, together with Henry VIII's niece, Lady Margaret Douglas, and another of Anne Boleyn's cousins, Mary Shelton, she compiled what is known as the Devonshire manuscript, mostly written during the 1530s and early 1540s, when she was still in her teens and 20s. This incredible document, now held in the British Library, is a collection of poems written in all three women's hands, plus the hands of 16 others, mostly unidentified, but including Mary Fitzroy's half-uncle, Lord Thomas Howard, who was also Margaret Douglas's lover, and Margaret's son, Henry Stuart, future husband of Mary Queen of Scots, To be clear though, the women are considered the primary authors, and Mary is believed to be the person who wrote out a poem called O Happy Dames in her rather scrappy hand. Over half the poems were originally by Thomas Wyatt, paramour of Anne Boleyn, and the manuscript is a major source for his works. It's been digitised and is freely available online with transcriptions, and I'll leave it linked in the description box for you. Mary was also interested in religion. Though raised a Catholic and part of a prominent Catholic family which continued to adhere to the old faith, she converted to the kind of proto-Protestantism her cousin Queen Anne had favoured. In the late 1530s, as the jointure saga rolled on, the Duke of Norfolk had thoughts of remarrying his daughter, though he complained that there were few unmarried men in the kingdom with the rank and age to wed her. One of those who was considered, though, was Sir Thomas Seymour, brother of Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour. Such a union would have put the Howards right back into the heart of the royal family, for Mary would be the aunt of Jane's son, the future King Edward VI. The current king was keen on the match, saying that one of such lust and youth should be able to please her well at all points. I wonder what on earth he would have thought if he'd known Thomas would ultimately end up married to his own widow, Catherine Parr, and be making overtures, to put it very politely, to his daughter Elizabeth. Why didn't Thomas end up married to Mary Fitzroy, though? The answer seems to be that Mary herself, who was in a stronger position to refuse a match as a widowed duchess than she would have been as an unmarried girl, stopped the union, aware that remarriage might prevent her from getting her jointure. Also, Thomas was a mere knight at this time, and despite his proximity to little Prince Edward, he really wasn't on the same social level as Mary, the daughter and widow of two dukes. Finally, in late 1538, Mary began to receive financial grants from the king, who needed her father's military support in case of attack from Catholic Europe, who Henry had greatly angered thanks to his abandonment of Catherine of Aragon and split from the church in Rome. Though the initial grant was only £12 per year, by 1540 it had risen to £744, with the money drawn from former monastic properties rather than her dead husband's estates, which had already been largely regranted elsewhere. The money must have been very welcome. According to Murphy, the Duke of Norfolk seems not to have been overly generous with his daughter financially, wary of the fact that providing for her would suggest that she was his responsibility rather than the king's. As well as easing financial pressures, Mary was also back at court for certain occasions, welcoming Anne of Cleves to England in January 1540. She was even ranked next to Lady Margaret Douglas, who was technically second in line to the throne at this stage after Prince Edward, as the king's daughters were both legally illegitimate and were still years away from being restored to the succession. When Anne of Cleves' marriage foundered after just 6 months, and another of Mary's cousins, Catherine Howard, became Henry's fifth wife, Mary was taken into the new queen's household. Of course, this situation wasn't to last. After less than a year and a half, Queen Catherine's premarital behaviour with certain men came to light, as did her continuing relationship with one of them, Thomas Culpeper. The Queen was imprisoned and her household broken up. In the midst of this upheaval, we get a glimpse of what was happening to Mary Fitzroy in a letter from the Privy Council to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, dated the 11th of November 1541, which said that the rest of her, meaning Catherine Howard's, servants shall depart on Monday next. Sir John Dudley shall conduct my Lady Mary to my Lord Princes, that's Mary Tudor and Prince Edward, with a convenient number of the Queen's servants, and Lady Margaret Douglas, who had been imprisoned at Sion Abbey after a disastrous engagement to Mary Fitzroy's half-uncle Thomas Howard, shall go to kennel in Norfolk with my Lady of Richmond, if my lord her father and she are content. So Mary was back home in kennel with Margaret Douglas in tow, and before long the tragic Catherine Howard had been executed on the king's orders in February 1542, alongside Jane Parker Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, her lady-in-waiting, and the widow of she and Mary's cousin, George Boleyn. Mary was to stay mostly at Kennel over the next few years, still sending and receiving the odd gift from her former father-in-law or his new wife, Catherine Parr, and entertaining friends. She was also at court in 1546 when the French ambassadors visited. She was still unmarried though, and in the mid-1540s, the idea of wedding her to Thomas Seymour was floated again, this time alongside the idea of marrying the children of her two brothers to the children of Edward Seymour. Mary wouldn't agree though, perhaps still aware of Thomas Seymour's lower rank and maybe sensing what a dangerously ambitious, yet at the same time quite stupid man he really was. He would end up getting himself executed during the reign of his nephew Edward VI after he tried to seize control of the boy king from his older brother. Mary's refusal to marry Thomas Seymour enraged her brother, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, who showed what a pig he was by suggesting that she use the opportunity the marriage negotiations provided to get to court, catch the ageing king's eye, and perhaps become his next mistress, in order to promote her own and her family's interests. Mary was appalled and disgusted at the suggestion that she not only commit adultery with a married man, but also incest with her father-in-law, telling her brother she'd rather her whole family perish and, quote, she would cut her own throat rather than she would consent to such a villainy. She wasn't going to have to deal with her sibling for much longer though, as the Howard family were about to experience yet another disaster which would permanently relieve her of his company. Lord Surrey had long been a problem, even getting himself locked up in Windsor Castle at one point in lieu of having his hand cut off as a punishment for attacking a courtier. His ultimate downfall was initially sparked by his military failures in France in 1545 and 1546, however. Ordered back to England in March 1546, his position continued to deteriorate as he was suspected of planning to take control of Prince Edward in the event of the king's death, and in December of that year both he and his father were arrested and placed in the Tower of London, with the Duke suspected of conspiring with his heir in the same matter. Mary was at kennel with the Duke's mistress, Elizabeth Holland, when the King's commissioners arrived to search the place and question the women. The two ladies, only just out of bed, met with them in the dining room, and we have the following account of what happened next. On hearing how the matter stood, the Duchess was sore perplexed, trembling and like to fall down. But recovering, she reverently upon her knees humbled herself to the King, saying that although constrained by nature to love her father, whom she ever thought a true subject, and her brother, whom she noteth to be a rash man, she would conceal nothing, but declare in writing all she can remember, advised her to use truth and frankness, and not despair. The commissioners also noted the poor financial situation of a woman who was a dowager duchess and the king's daughter-in-law, saying they had, quote, examined her coffers and closet, but find nothing worth sending, all being very bare, and her jewels sold to pay her debts, as her maidens and the almoner say. The actual charge brought against Surrey in January 1547 was that, and I quote his Oxford DNB article here, he had on the 7th of October 1546 at Kennel displayed in his own heraldry the royal arms and insignia with 3 labels silver, thereby threatening the king's title to the throne and the prince's inheritance. The entire Howard family now began to turn on each other to save themselves. The Duke of Norfolk made the following submission on the 12th of January. I have offended the king in opening his secret councils at divers times to sundry persons to the peril of his highness and disappointing of his affairs. Likewise I have concealed high treason in keeping secret the false acts of my son Henry Earl of Surrey, in using the arms of St. Edward the Confessor, which pertain only to kings. Under questioning, Mary Fitzroy gave evidence against both her father and brother, and Elizabeth Holland spoke against her lover, as did Mary's mother, the Duchess of Norfolk, who hated her estranged husband. The story of Surrey trying to make his sister Henry VIII's mistress came out, and Surrey's fate was quickly sealed. Though the records of his trial at the Guildhall on the 13th of January are lost, we know from surviving information that it centred around his use of royal arms and conspiracy to seize control of any minority government. He was found guilty, sentenced to death, and executed on Tower Hill on the 19th of January 1547. His father would have followed him to the grave, except that King Henry himself died on the 28th of January, and Norfolk was spared. Now it's easy to denounce Mary for speaking against her family, but the picture is more nuanced than that. There can be no doubt that she had a very difficult relationship with them. They'd used or attempted to use her as a pawn in their machinations, and she didn't feel her father had helped her enough with her attempts to get her jointure. Her lack of goods by 1546, despite her status as a duchess, shows he wasn't supporting her well financially either, even though she was in his house. Yet, I think we can see in Mary's reaction to their arrest the actions of a very frightened woman, with no husband to protect her, who'd already seen 3 of her cousins executed by the increasingly tyrannical Henry VIII, and who'd awoken one morning to find the king's men in her home cataloguing the Howard family goods for seizure and telling her that her closest male relatives were under arrest. The commissioners advised her that truth and frankness were her best hope of mercy from the king, and from the outset Mary seems to have tried to save her father at the very least, calling him a true subject whilst noting her brother's rash temperament, which was no secret to anyone who knew him. Those who questioned her later reported that some passionate words of her brother she likewise repeated, as also some circumstantial speeches little for his advantage, yet so as they seemed to clear her father. In fact, nothing Mary said about either man was ultimately what had them sentenced to death. It was Sir Gawain Carew, to whom she'd related the argument with her brother about making her the king's mistress, who spilled the beans on that particular story, not Mary, and she seemed very vague about what her brother had done with his arms. In reality, I think Surrey brought his problems on himself and his wider family. Mary hadn't forced him into any of his mistakes, and she doesn't seem to have given up any information to her interrogators which would have cost him his head. Furthermore, her actions after his death suggest that she actually had considerable family loyalty. Norfolk spent the whole of Edward VI's reign in prison in the Tower, during which time Mary tried to secure his release, though to no avail. She and her mother visited him sometimes, and she asked that he be allowed to write to the young king, but this request was refused. She also took in Surrey's 5 children who had been taken from their mother, plus another nephew, and raised them like her own, having the famous John Foxe, who later wrote the Book of Martyrs, become their tutor. This was all despite her somewhat limited financial means. We've already established that she was fairly poor given her duchess status, and with her father in prison and many of the Howard lands and houses seized, she didn't have his money to fall back on either. Though her own lands and income remained largely intact, they brought in only £626 13 shillings 4d at the end of Henry's reign, despite £744 being settled on her back in 1540. Edward VI did eventually grant her an annuity of £100 to help to cover her costs, but there can be no doubt that the entire situation was a difficult one for Mary. She also never remarried, perhaps because she didn't want to, perhaps because she was no longer the catch she had once been, given her family's disgrace and her precarious financial situation. Any money she had was for her lifetime only, so a husband couldn't even hope to inherit a large sum from her. In 1553, Edward VI died, and his Catholic half-sister Mary I came to the throne. The Duke of Norfolk was immediately released from the Tower and restored to his positions, while the Duchess of Richmond's nephew took on his deceased father's title of Earl of Surrey. The Duchess herself was not popular with the new queen, though. She was of the Reformed faith after all, and had been close to her cousin Anne Boleyn, Queen Mary's hated stepmother. The 2 women, technically sisters-in-law, kept their distance from one another. Barely a year later, in August 1554, the Duke of Norfolk was dead. He and Mary Fitzroy seem to have buried the hatchet before he went. In his will, he left her £500 and commended her for her efforts during his imprisonment to have him released. She didn't have long to mourn him or enjoy the money, though. In January 1556, she was described in a document as the late Duchess of Richmond and Somerset, indicating that she was dead at about the age of 36, though we don't know the exact date on which she died, and some authors contend, without any evidence that I've seen, that it was as late as December 1557. She was buried in Framlingham alongside the long-dead teenage husband she had barely known, never lived with, and even struggled to be recognised as the wife of. Their tomb was never completed, though, and lacks even effigies of them on top of it. Mary's life had started with so much promise. The daughter of one of the greatest men in the land, from one of its most powerful families, she was clever and articulate, and her cousin Anne's rise and her own glittering marriage to the boy who was then the king's only son had seemed to secure for her by the age of 14 an unassailable position at the top of the Tudor hierarchy. There was even a chance she might be queen consort someday if Henry Fitzroy became king. Yet in the space of just a couple of months, from May to July 1536, it all fell apart, and at 17, Mary's best days and all her great prospects were behind her. The remaining 19 years of her life were mostly overshadowed by money worries, failed attempts to get her remarried, and the trauma of losing her cousin Queen Catherine, then her brother, seeing her father imprisoned, having to take in 5 children and care for them on a limited income, and witnessing the seeming ruin of her house, even though it was rising from the ashes once again by the time of her own death. It had been a turbulent life, to say the least, and yet it is one which is now largely forgotten by history, with Mary relegated to just a piece of collateral damage in Henry VIII's ongoing destruction of the Boleyn and Howard clans. I therefore hope you enjoyed hearing about the life of his mostly overlooked daughter-in-law, and that I've succeeded in bringing her out of the shadows for you a little bit. Before I go, I'd like to say thank you to my patrons whose support is so important in helping me to keep doing what I'm doing. And if you'd like to become one of them too and get access to bonus material like extra podcasts, early access to ad-free videos, and recommendations for other great history content on the web, check out my site at patreon.com/historycalling. If you have Irish ancestry, you might also be interested in my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon as an ebook and paperback. The link is below for you. For some free bonus material, sign up to my mailing list on my website, historycallingofficial.com, and you'll get 2 complimentary downloads about recognising good versus bad history books and interviewing family members about your family tree, plus my monthly newsletter. Finally, thank you as well to those of you who so generously support the channel using the thanks button underneath videos. Let me know in the comments what you make of Mary and her life, and if you like this video, I think you'll love my biographies of Henry Fitzroy and his mother Bessie. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.